Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Ghoul Guide Association. We, of course, are your Ghoul Guides. I am Lauren.
And I'm Mary.
And we are beginning today a multi-part series all about the intersections and overlaps between, shall we say, the history of witchcraft? Yeah, the history of witchcraft and the history of the Gothic. So, Mary, do you want to give people a bit of a sneak peek about what we'll be covering over these next few episodes?
Yeah, so I guess in a way we've kind of gone a little bit chronological.
Yeah.
Just because, again, we love a good snowball, and the best way to kind of like see what, the snowball is picking up is to follow it from some kind of origin to like where it is today. So that's basically what we'll be doing. There'll be 4 parts. So today, Lauren, you'll be talking about pre-Christian and Greek and Roman witches.
Yay!
So we'll delve into that shortly. And then the next episode, I'll be taking you through some British witchcraft, focusing, on all those well-known witch trials and witch hunts. Then afterwards, we'll be hopping over the pond to talk about Salem.
And a jump.
Yeah, to talk about Salem and America. And yeah, the developments that happened in witchcraft over
probably will be
there.
the third appearance of ergotism on this podcast, which is a bit ridiculous considering we only have 20 episodes so far.
Yeah. And then we'll be finishing with postmodern witchcraft, which is basically, just what does witchcraft mean today? And through all of these kind of topics and historical periods, we'll be talking not just about the history, but how that kind of relates to Gothic narratives and the Gothic mode. And we may even have a special bonus episode around Halloween. So watch out for that. It will be a witchy themed one.
Of course.
Yeah. So it's technically part of this mini series, but we're not going to tell you what that is yet. So you'll just have to wait.
We thought this was a good one for spooky season because, spooky season is officially from like the 22nd of September to, I suppose, Christmas we would count. But I personally think it goes into Christmas, and maybe we'll do something at Christmas to explain why. But yeah, we're going to be doing witches and witchcraft, and specifically the tradition of witchcraft and how it developed. I will caveat, be focusing on the European and then North American concepts of witchcraft. We will probably talk a little bit in the last episode about some of the appropriation of other cultures that sometimes happens in modern witchcraft. But obviously witchcraft is like a huge topic. But because we are very much talking about this as the Gothic and the development of the Gothic, we are going to stick to European tradition of witchcraft and kind of how that developed and how that interlinks with the Gothic. Not to say that in future...
it's also just what we're more familiar with.
Yeah,
it's talk about what you know, which isn't to say that we're not interested in other forms of witchcraft, as Lauren said, stick around for part 4. But it's also, I think sometimes from a kind of colonial perspective as well, the influence of the European tradition is so vast that it is sometimes useful to look at what the kind of colonial side of things is doing, and then to see how people are reacting to that.
Yeah, because there's a certain argument that says that the term witchcraft is a European one and it's a colonial one because, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk today about pre-Christian, it's a term that's often used like retroactively, wasn't always identified as witchcraft, but there's a lot of, tales from all over the world that include witches and the concept of witchcraft, but we are going to be focusing on that European tradition. And Mary, do you want to explain, just as like a little amuse-bouche, a little palate cleanser maybe, about why the Gothic and witchcraft are so heavily intertwined. I know that might seem like a really obvious question. So listeners and viewers, you might be like, what the fuck, Lauren? Like, this is not our first Gothic radio. But as with all things, I feel like there is a deeper connection than perhaps the one that we know as a pop culture phenomenon that witches are associated with the macabre and Halloween and the supernatural, and those things are all part of the Gothic.
Well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you for that.
You're welcome, Mary.
I mean, I guess when you think about the Gothic, it's all about the past coming to bear on either the present or perhaps the future. But it's also about power dynamics. You have a monster that might be the kind of tyrant, the lord who is chasing a woman through a castle, or it might be a vampire or some other kind of supernatural entity. And I think that what the witch is really interested in doing is kind of melding a lot of these identities, bringing in stuff that is older, perhaps supernatural, but melding that whole kind of thing about what if the other is a woman, but what if that other is a woman and powerful? And that's not to say that there aren't traditions of witchcraft that also encompass, other genders. Witches and the traditions of witchcraft are not necessarily exclusively female or relating to women. But I think that, especially in terms of the Gothic, they often do intertwine in that kind of gendered way and in that gendered power dynamic. Either witches are something to be feared because they are the other, or perhaps they are something a little bit in that liminal space where maybe you think someone is a victim or a heroine, but actually they're not. And it's a way of fighting back. And I think especially when we get to talk about real cases of witches that are persecuted, it's also, again, think about like the power dynamics and those hierarchies, because this is exactly what the Gothic does, especially those early kind of Gothic tales where you have women being persecuted by men. And this is what we see time and time and again in actual cases of witch hunts, where you have often women persecuted by the patriarchy because there's something that the patriarchy does not like. And it might just be that they have power and influence in a non-supernatural way over communities. Or it might just be because, some groups of men just like to have power. But yeah, we'll discuss this as we get more. But I think that is why it is inherently a Gothic subject, because there's all of these dynamics of, is witchcraft bad? Where does it come from? Does it come from the devil? Is it something rooted in perhaps womanhood itself, in nature? Where is the origin of this power? Is it supernatural? Is it something that's just been interpreted in that way? And then how do we navigate and negotiate those stories of persecution?
Yeah. And liminality is something that is, we'll talk about that quite a lot this episode. And I think it comes into play like very early on with the idea of European witchcraft, particularly in the like early classical periods. Well, early classical is a bit of a misnomer. When I say that, I mean early in terms of literary tradition. The early classical is very, very ancient. But yeah, like when we get these like classical representations in people like Homer and Euripides, there is a lot of liminality to these figures that are linked to the idea of witchcraft, be it that they literally manage the space in between things, or that their identity is kind of fluctuating and uncertain, or that they have these multiple different identities. Okay, so let's dive in. I am aware that we didn't do any like, hey, how are you at the beginning of this episode? So just to let everybody know that's interested, we're both fine. But there's lots of things to talk about.
If you're listening, we have not been kidnapped. You don't need to send any hostage money. We're not currently trapped in any cave of any sort.
Reports of our demise have been greatly overstated.
Yeah.
All right. So let's dive in. So I am specifically going to be talking today about the pre-Christian history of witchcraft. And yes, specifically focusing on the classical ideas, because again, when we talk about Europe, we're not really talking about one homogenous nation. It's a continent, for one thing, and a continent with a lot of difference within it. And actually, at this early period of time, certain areas of Europe, like those that are in Asia Minor or places like Turkey, those regions around Russia, Eastern Europe in particular, were seen actually as not being part of Europe. They were seen as being racially different, culturally different, linguistically different. You know, we have Romance languages. So again, even when I say Europe, what I really mean is more Western, classical with a capital C, Europe. But again, this is a edutainment podcast, and we'd be doing 15 episodes if we dug into everything. So I've tried to keep this as concise as possible, because this is meant to be for fun and not to put you to sleep. All right.
Although, you know, as someone who quite enjoys falling asleep listening to stuff, you know, I don't mind if this is your, you know, like falling asleep podcast.
Yeah, if that's fine by me. If you want the Ghoul Guides ASMR edition, as long as you don't make me edit it, I'm fine with that, because ASMR sets my brain on fire and it makes me want to scratch my ears out.
Yeah.
So we are talking about pre-Christian, classical, largely Greco-Roman, Hellenistic, Latin witchcraft. What does that mean? So this is the thing, and we'll talk about this in the final episode when we jump forwards to contemporary, modern witchcraft, modern, often neo-pagan witchcraft, which is a term we'll explain in that episode because it is quite a complicated one, often identifies pre-Christian as this, again, one monolithic thing. Now, that means no disrespect. There's a reason that happens, and we will talk about that in that episode. But what's really important to remember is it's a little bit like calling something Tudor. Gaelic, Celtic, Welsh folklore and culture didn't really have a concept of witchcraft in the way that we would consider it to be now, because magic and the idea of magic and sorcery is something very different. It's not transgressive and it's not rebellious, whereas we as a modern society tend to use this, you know, rediscovery and reclamation of pre-Christian Britain as being a pushback against a patriarchal, largely Protestant British state. But actually, when we look back at a lot of that mythology, figures that now are often seen as being related to witchcraft, like, for example, the Morrigan, an Irish deity who is often associated with the mother maid and crone trichotomy, often now is a popular figure in Wicca and in paganism, but at the time was just kind of seen as a goddess of magic. So what we think of as being witchcraft and what we now associate as witchcraft are kind of two different things. There are some figures, however, like, and I hope I'm saying this right, the Nick Nevin, who is a Scottish figure who is often described as a witch. She's also either a fairy queen or some kind of goddess, but the actual idea of witchcraft is associated with her. So it's not to say that there's an absence of this idea of witchcraft, which is largely a gendered one, and is usually about some kind of communion rather than necessarily an innateness. So there are these figures present, but they are more like divine figures rather than witches. And that's because in these pre-Christian, I'm going to call them native. Again, I know that they're not strictly native, but these native British cultures, the existence of magic is something that was seen as being like a definite thing. And again, maybe one day we'll do an episode on Druids, because that's such a fascinating history and one that the Gothic is always obsessed with. But it's much more present. And the similar thing goes when we take it back to the classical period, to ancient Egypt. And again, ancient Egypt is not one big homogenous monolithic thing. It's a society and a culture that spanned multiple dynasties, multiple generations, multiple cities, and centuries. But in general, in ancient Egypt, there's the concept of Heka, which is more like magic as a cosmic life force almost. And for example, Isis, a goddess again, who is often in modern contemporary magic called upon. Isis was the goddess of magic, not a goddess of witchcraft. And both priests and priestesses worshipped Isis. Isis was a goddess who was very important in all aspects because magic was seen as being, all around, so to speak. So we are talking about a specific tradition of witchcraft. Am I making sense here, Mary?
Yes, I am just wondering if maybe what might be helpful is just to briefly explain what we mean by witches and witchcraft, because you've mentioned a lot of really interesting terms here, goddesses, fairy queen, magic as well. And if these are not witches,
yes,
then what is a witch?
So I think our kind of like base definition for what we're saying is that if we're talking about mythology, folklore, we are talking about the difference between divinity and divine beings. And then we're talking about mortals or demi-mortals or demigods, depending on which way you want to put it away. All those that are favoured by the gods. You get this both in Irish epic mythology, as you also do in Greco-Roman, and of course also in Norse. And it's not so much witchcraft because there's no ritual, there's no communion, there's no sisterhood, and it's not gendered. I don't want to bring the binary too much into it because it's, kind of regressive and counterproductive. But we as a modern society, and I say modern as in from early modern onwards, witches and the concept of witches have been those on the outside, those who commune, those who do not necessarily go along with the central divine narrative of a monotheistic Christian religion, who use older forces, who use nature to, and this idea that they are capable of subverting or misleading to create magic. So I think, we've got the stereotypical witch in the black porty hat on the broom, which is your I guess like your Hammer horror cartoon Gothic witch. But I think in terms of like a Gothic tradition of the witch, I would say we're probably thinking about, an other capital O figure who is a minority, usually a woman, or certainly someone who is not ascribing to set gender roles, who is not ascribing to the white Christian norm and operates outside of it and is therefore transgressive and subversive.
Yeah, and I like that idea of we can think about it visually and literally in terms of being other and being outside, in that I think a lot of the figures, whether we're talking about witch figures or maybe proto-witch figures or figures that we're, reading retrospectively as witches, even if they might not have been identified as witches, in their kind of contemporaneous periods. But like maybe not living in society, but maybe living outside, like on the outside skirts, perhaps because of their minority status, or perhaps their minority status is that they are an outsider. But yeah, just reinforcing that otherness and that physical outsiderness. And then also this idea of craft and ritual. I think that those are quite important. It's not necessarily something that you like you said, it's that innate that you can do, but it's that you can do with certain things and in a certain way.
And there's a very specific reason for that I think comes from the Greco-Roman era, and particularly the later post-Renaissance Western European, specifically British, reinterpretations of the classical era, capital C. I think, that idea of craft becomes really, really important, because even though I've just kind of said, in these periods, like magic, it's more of like a, it's the force, it's all around us in all of every living thing and all that stuff, which is a big, that's one of the concepts in a lot of ancient Egyptian theology. The Greeks had the idea of things like, I think it's pronounced Ousia, O-U-S-I-A, which was like a sort of power or energy to do with like the soul. But witchcraft, as we think of it, does develop and originate during these periods. So two things can be true at once. Would it be a podcast about the Gothic if we didn't contradict ourselves and yet still be true?
The Gothic is full of,
yeah, exactly.
contradictions.
So both ancient Greece and Rome had these, bigger beliefs. They have a pantheon of gods, some of them borrowed from older civilizations, some of them new, some of them developed, some of them interchangeable with one another, trying to, do anything about Greek mythology is always confusing, because particularly when you're looking at an 18th century reinterpretation of it, because you're like, well, who are they reading? Where have they got this from? Did they invent it? Was this a lesser known version? Always great fun. But so they do have these bigger things, but they have this idea as well that magic is linked to faith, that magic is innate, but also can be called upon. So it does start to move away from things like the Egyptian magi concept and the idea of Heka. Not everybody has innate magic. In fact, only a chosen few have innate magic, and they're often perceived as being descended from gods or touched by gods or otherworldly creatures like nymphs or dryads. So it does start to kind of move away and become closer to this idea of it being some kind of craft or some kind of still faith-based, that, you could pray to a god and a god might give you an enchanted sword or, a special thing. But there was also the idea that certain herbs, certain potions, certain tinctures, and this is largely because witch, as we translate it into English, meant lots of different things. So, for example, when we are translating things from like Roman Latin, we find that historically everything from seer, midwife, chanter, priestess, apothecary, potion maker, healer, multiple different female roles, female professions get translated as witch. Now, this is, of course, partially because women, for the large part, could not study and be trained in some of the major, I don't even know, they weren't always just academic, because a lot of them were also religious, but the major institutions, let's put it like that. So women and men are separated, and particularly in ancient Greece, Athens in particular, had very, very, very strict gender roles. Women in Athens were expected to be a very specific type of way, which is why I'm always very skeptical when you're reading stuff about, Britain being the reclamation of the ancients and classical era, because actually there's a lot of misogyny and bullshit in that. But for example, Athens is a good one. Other communities less so. Sparta's a pretty interesting one, and that translates over to Rome. Rome again, in some ways, that women could study certain things. There was more gender freedom, but in other ways also very restrictive. I don't want to be, basic bitch about it, but historically, being a woman, not great in major civilizations. So, which translates to these multiple different female roles. And most of these roles are specifically linked to a certain craft, and a craft that gave women a power and a knowledge that was generally only passed between women, because a healer was outside of the standard medical practice. A potion maker was outside of the standard medical practice. A priestess was outside of the central medical practice. So, yeah.
So here, I think you've just identified such a key aspect of like the witch tradition, if we're looking at it from a gendered perspective, in that if you were a woman, you might not necessarily, like you say, be able to go and train, and they didn't have qualifications in those days, but if you wanted to be the equivalent of a doctor, whether that be in the medical profession or through like the religious school, you couldn't, because the doors were shut to women. But what you could do is learn from your mum and your aunt, maybe your grandmother, like, oh, this herb works for this ailment, or like if you mix these things together, you can get this ointment, and that's how you treat X. And it is this kind of generational knowledge that is passed down that allows for women. And I think especially when we think of things like childbirth, and this is again where we get these gendered aspects of the witch tradition, but like you would primarily have women there, and you would need this shared generational knowledge to help, because I mean, you said being a woman wasn't very fun in the past. Child mortality rates in childbirth were horrendous. Like, it's only really recently that there's been less of a possibility that you will die, although obviously these
still pretty horrendous.
And especially when you look at it in terms of race. But we, as a whole, the Western world has made a lot of advances because of the medical advances, but you wouldn't have that if you go back like 1,000 years or more. And so you would have to just rely on this knowledge that would often be passed down through generations. And therefore, that's what you get, is just this kind of organic sisterhood, as it were.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's outside of the taught disciplines.
It was literally outside, because sometimes these were stinky as professions, because herbalism, tanning, dyeing, also male, not gender exclusive professions or male professions. There were often people that had to live literally outside of town, because like tanning, for example, you literally soak things in piss. It stinks. And for example, like in Bristol, things like woad and certain dyes, like they stank to high heaven. And the same thing with a lot of like herbalism and potion making. So again, often it would be somebody that lived outside of the community, and you had to go to that person and be like, oh, I need this thing. Or it would be, if you were a noble woman, it might be somebody from a lower economical class, and you would send a servant to go and get a tincture or a poultice or a charm, whatever it might be. So you are already starting to get these conventions that have become parts of our modern concept of witchcraft. A couple of fun things, and we are talking around about kind of like 500 BCE to about 1020 CE. So again, sort of like towards the end of what we now call before the Common Era into the Common Era. But yeah, a couple of fun things. So this is something that is like really common. It's not hush hush and it's not quiet. Like, if you believe that there is a goddess of witchcraft, if you believe there's a god of the sun, if you believe there's a deity of basically anything that you can imagine, then you're not going to see witchcraft as being something dark and dangerous necessarily. That doesn't stick completely, but you're also going to believe it. So one of the things that both Greek and Roman societies had were curse tablets. So curse tablets,
I love it.
They usually called upon the gods, often gods like Kronos, Persephone, Hades, and Hecate, who we'll come to in a moment. So either chthonic gods, so underworld gods, or gods that represented liminality or vengeance, or were connected to the Titans. And it would be, you would curse somebody with a curse tablet, and you might just have the curse tablet made, or you might try and put it in their house, or you might, leave it on their doorstep as a threat, like a mafia threat. But these weren't specific to women, but they have increasingly become connected to witchcraft, partially because of the deities, particularly Persephone and Hecate, that they often call upon. But yeah, curse tablets, which is basically like, fuck you inscribed into a piece of stone.
Are we talking more kind of like anonymous Twitter, or are we talking more like Death Note in terms of like, please, I'm going to do this curse tablet and I hope that it comes true, or like, I just want to scream into a void?
I think it's more like a Death Note, although often not asking to kill someone. It's usually like a plague upon his house. Like,
because this is what I really love about pantheistic societies, is that because you have this whole pantheon of gods and minor kind of like deities and things, you might have shrines or temples to the big gods, but also to the smaller gods. And I think this is then where you get into the whole kind of
it's kind of like
thing. But you can go there and you can ask and you can leave an offering, and normally it will be like, please, can I have good weather for my crops? Or please, can you give me good health in this? But I love the idea of a curse tablet being like, hello, right, I want you to curse this person.
Like, dear Persephone, destroyer, wife of Hades, I just found out that my ex was cheating on me the entire time we were together, and I would like you to curse him with the most terrible genital rash that you have ever seen. Thanks, babes. And then you would probably do a sacrifice or an offering, and then maybe slip it through his mailbox, and then Persephone would be like, I got you, boo. And, plague upon his genitals. So, it was kind of more like that kind of thing. And that might sound familiar because, when we get into early modern witchcraft, we have things like poppets, curses and charms that you might put under someone's bed or in someone's house. And these do also come from earlier British traditions, but you can see kind of how these things are starting to take shape. But what I love about the curse tablets is that, you were invoking a particular god for a particular thing. Which is fantastic. The other thing that you may or may not have heard of is the Witches of Thessaly. Are you familiar with this concept?
I've heard, that name is familiar to me, but I could not tell you who they are, so please do enlighten me.
Yes, you might have heard of Thessaly, because Thessaly is, in Greek mythology, the birthplace of the hero Achilles, he who was dipped into the river Styx, but not his ankle, and of Jason, who we will be talking about shortly. A massive, massive dickwad. But very important to the story of witchcraft. Two very, very famous Hellenistic heroes are from Thessaly. There's some debate about where Thessaly is, but multiple accounts round about, I think they're mostly from like 4th and 5th century BCE. One of which is, I think you say it Lucan, his multi-volume story about a civil war between Caesar and Pompey, it's called Pharsalia, refers to Thessaly as basically being famous for its witches.
I love it.
Yeah, and there's another story that talks about like so in Paracelsus, they go and seek guidance from a witch. There's other accounts that talk about these witches of Thessaly. It's probably a group of female astrologers, because they seem to mostly go for like omens and stuff like that. So a bit of a Macbeth's witches type thing. Seems to be like they go to consult the witches, and the witches, tell them this is a good or a bad idea. So it might well be that they were just astrologers. So it's a bunch of Huns with a telescope mapping the stars, and people are like, they're witches. Because of course, if you've got a group of women practicing some kind of craft together, that does make them witches, negatively and positively. Some scholars have suspected or kind of posited that maybe because Thessaly was more like a colony, I think, and seen as being not part of the core Greek, like they weren't Hellenic. And do you know what term originally meant not Hellenic?
Oh, now you're really putting me on the spot. No, tell me.
I bet you do when I tell you. Barbaric.
Ah.
So it's possible that actually from these very early texts, in terms, and I say early as in literary canon, that witches and calling groups witches or saying, oh, this region is known for its witches, was already part of this kind of like xenophobic nationalism of identifying something as barbaric and not Greek. And of course, what does barbaric come to be ascribed with after the fall of Rome?
It's the barbarous Goths.
The barbarous Goths. I thought that was really interesting, because it's one of those things where I would always think of witch as being on par with barbaric, but actually it might literally have been like a like for like.
Like a synonym.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting. And just as an aside, lately there has been a lot of discourse about people obsessing over Rome. Just online, and I always think I wouldn't ever really obsess over Rome, but then I'm like, but I do quite like the bit where it gets sacked by all those barbarous Goths.
I was like, I think about ancient Rome all the time, but that because I'm an 18th century Gothicist that specializes in nationalism.
Yeah, and specifically like. For me, I'm like, specifically the fall of Rome. That's what I'm interested in. Yeah, tell me.
At least once a week. That's really funny.
Thank you to those pesky, witchy, barbarous Goths for that.
So one of my, so it's a TikTok trend, ask your boyfriend or your partner or your brother or your dad how often they think about the Roman Empire. And people were quite shocked that it's men think about the Roman Empire quite often. And it was quite funny because I'm in a group chat full of my girlfriends, and they were like, why is this? And I was like, do you guys want, like, I have an actual academic theory about this that is part of my work on British masculinity and nationalism. And I was like, do you want my actual answer, or are you just like chatting? And they were like, can you put it in a sentence? And I was like, yes. Ancient Rome equals like a mythologizing of British masculinity, falsehood of chivalry, and then was like, basically it's patriarchy.
Yeah, but it's the same way that like a lot of white nationalists in particular, but just more broadly, like other kind of aspects of society that puts whiteness on a pedestal. It's the same way that these groups and communities idolize Greek and Rome, and part of the thing they do is, but look at all these statues with the perfect white alabaster, and it's like all this kind of stuff. And it's like, Did you not realize that they're only white because all the paint has come off? And these statues and all of these kinds of buildings would have been so colourful.
Yeah.
So colourful.
Gaudy.
And it's like
they were gaudy.
Yes, gaudy. And we know that some of the statues, the people would definitely, you know, maybe the kind of the ethnicity or the nationality is unknown, but it definitely wouldn't have been white. It's fascinating how people are obsessed with these myths, whether it's myths of race, myths of nationality, or myths of like masculinity.
My short argument is that the reason that particularly white Western men are obsessed with the Roman Empire is because white British masculinity was built on using things like Roman war tactics as a way to create a new identity for men in the colonial empirical space. But that's a different episode.
Yes, thank you for this little Roman tangent. Now back to witches.
Back to witches, as we should.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's part of everyday life and culture. A witch might still be an outsider figure. So there might still be, you know, the witch who lives just outside of town, or the witch who lives in the woods, or, you know, the old woman who never had children and has been a midwife and a healer. And actually in Greek court documents from, you know, multiple centuries, but particularly like the kind of 1st century CE, you do get women being tried for witchcraft. So these liminal identities, things like healer, midwife, chanter, seer, that were kind of shrouded in a certain amount of mystery, often connected to gender. People were tried for witchcraft. People were like, have you cursed this person? And I do think sometimes it probably was a way of controlling women who had too much power within a society or who were seen as being subversive. But the slight difference is people were practicing witchcraft. Now, whether or not that witchcraft did anything, of course, it depends on what you believe. But it wasn't a shrouded secret practice in the same way as early modern witchcraft was. Whether or not early modern witchcraft even existed, we'll get to that next time. So that's the concept, shall we say. Who are some of our key figures? Now, I have picked 3 who are largely Greek, but of course, a lot of Greek mythology translates over to Roman mythology. There's also a lot of suggestion that figures like Hecate bled into other mythologies. So the Nixon, who I said before is from Scottish folklore. Some people suspect that maybe that is actually another interpretation of Hecate. And we find this all across mythologies, be they European, Western or Eastern, be they Asian, be they Egyptian or North African. There's a lot of blending of cultures, a lot of borrowing. It happens constantly. This is, you know, a very fluctuating period. And as we mentioned in our one of our previous episodes, it's also a period of like secret and cult religions. And what we mean by that is within a pantheistic society, just worshipping one god or goddess rather than the whole pantheon. So there does start to be some more kind of like ritualistic, shrouded, secret, when you have cults for goddesses like Hecate, who I've mentioned a few times now. So she is one of the, I want to say major, because she's in multiple different traditions. She's in multiple different versions. She appears again and again and again. And she was also one of the gods of the household, along with people like Zeus. So quite a key figure. Her origin is debated. Again, I won't get into that. Some people have suggested that Heka, perhaps came from an ancient Egyptian origin. Some people have said, you know, maybe she came from like other areas of Europe. There's a couple of cults that seem to have been devoted to her, but most people are like, yeah, no, she's part of the OG Greek pantheon, as much as there is an OG Greek pantheon. So yeah, she is one of the protectors of the household. So almost every house would have a shrine to Hecate, and it would usually be in a doorway, because one of the things that she is associated with is doorways, crossings, borders, and crossroads. Where have we heard that before?
Yeah. All these liminal in between spaces.
Yes. So of course,
that are often associated with dark things.
El Diablo himself.
Yeah.
So she is a liminal goddess, and that is very important. She's also a underworld goddess. She's one of the Gothic deities. She's seen as being she is often represented by keys, because she's kind of seen as being the one who controls the passageways or the kind of crossings.
I think this is really interesting because in Jewish traditions, you would have what's called the mezuzah, which would be a scroll with the kind of prayer of God, and it would be on doorways. And I think depending on how orthodox or how much you want to have that in as part of your daily ritual and as part of your kind of living space, some people would have it just on their kind of outside door, but sometimes you would have a mezuzah on every single doorway. And I want it's just this interesting thing about doorways being a space that actually we don't necessarily think about a lot in our kind of contemporary lives.
No.
Unless it's part of your kind of religion and rituals.
Modern people fucking love open living spaces. They're like, get rid of all the doorways, open plan living.
But I think that is interesting that because obviously Jewish traditions were around contemporaneously, and all of these kind of contemporaneous traditions are interested in doorways.
Yes. And it's interesting that she in particular is seen as being the kind of keeper of the keys, holder of the keys, guardian of doorways. She's often featured as Persephone's companion. In the Persephone Hades myth, it's often Hecate who goes to Demeter to bring Persephone back to Hades, and then keeps her company, and then escorts her once her 6 months is up. So that's possibly also where that comes from. But round about so some sources I saw said 1st century CE, others said that this is popularized by writers like Sophocles and Euripides. We'll mention him again shortly. She starts to then also become associated with sorcery, magic, and witchcraft. And it's interesting that sorcery and witchcraft are seen as being two separate things. And best I can understand it, this is when we start to get that difference between sorcery that would later become alchemy, and the concept of magic as a scientific practice, and witchcraft being about nature and about healing and about herbalism and potion making and, scrying and seeing and fortune telling. And the nature of these being largely patriarchal civilizations, those are gendered into male and female, because very rarely would women be given the chance to be a scientist. Now, there are some female figures that are described as sorceresses, but largely what I could understand, this is where you get a lot of that splitting between, in the European literary tradition, the concept of sorcery and witchcraft is, one is a science and is studied, and the other one is about oral traditions, passed down knowledge, communion with nature, communion with the goddess, and about sisterhood, and that kind of women-based sorority, I think. So she is often linked to the moon goddesses, so Luna, Artemis / Diana, and there's a lot of moon imagery associated with her, but she is also a triple goddess. I don't think she's necessarily a Mother Maiden Crone figure, but interesting again that we've got another of these significant goddesses that is a triple goddess, and a lot of her statues have that kind of there's 3 of her And she has like 3 faces, which again, very cool. So she is kind of the first big witchcraft hitter. Is Hecate.
She's the one that everyone kind of models themselves after.
Yeah. And if you are a Gothic pop culture fan, you've probably heard her name invoked before.
Like you say Hecate, and I am immediately transported to watching a Buffy episode where Hecate is invoked by numerous witches.
Yeah, exactly. So, often seen as being, one of the major deities. And again, we've still got that connection between the divine and witchcraft, but the craft part of witchcraft is starting to come into play here.
Yeah.
And it's more about, an invocation by those largely women who were in these professions as their deity. She is then connected to the other 2 figures that we're going to talk about in some mythologies, but largely accepted to not actually be their mother. But the other 2 figures we're going to talk about are an aunt and niece, Circe and Medea. So Circe, if you are a novel reader, you probably have seen a beautiful gilt shiny cover by Madeline Miller. I think circa 2020, because that was a very, very popular novel. But Circe is perhaps one of the most famous pre-Christian witch figures. And certainly that is because she figures in, the pre-Christian, the Greek epic text, the one that everybody would have got made to read in the 18th century. Homer's Odyssey, the story of Odysseus making his very, very long journey full of mishaps, mayhem, and adultery back from the fall of Troy.
And obviously long depends on your interpretation. The actual, geographical journey was not very long at all. He just, for some reason, did not want to go home.
He's like, oh my God, I miss my wife. I need to stay on this island and have 6 babies with this woman because I miss my wife so much.
Oh no, I've been trapped by a cyclops.
What a shame.
Sorry, it's just us throwing shade at Odysseus.
Yeah, fucking Odysseus, man. So, dickhead. Okay. So, Circe, often known as the witch So, Circe, often known as the Witch of Aiaia, that's spelled Aeaea, is very much associated with herbalism, with potion making, with ritual. She's frequently seen through both mythology and poetry as being someone who could curse, who could bless, who could heal, who could call upon nature. And you have this with the witches of Thessaly. They're often described as being able to pull the light down from the moon and things like that. So there's this very strong connection to nature, which of course is divine, but not always directly linked to gods and the gods' powers. Or often, the moon is represented almost primarily by female goddesses. She often also had a wand or a staff, and she uses this as a focus for her conjuring. So Circe certainly is a crafter. She's not a sorcerer in the way that we get some magical figures in Greek mythology. She's powerful, incredibly powerful, but it always seems to be that Circe uses, she drugs food, or she creates something, or she does a ritual. So we've got that craft element of witchcraft coming through with Circe. So sometimes she's the daughter of Hecate, but generally she is the daughter of Helios, the sun god, who you might be thinking isn't Apollo the sun god. He is the lesser sun god. He's he's also a son of a Titan. And the nymph Perse. So she is divine. She is a goddess. She's a minor goddess, but Circe is a goddess. So even though she is identified throughout this literature and the mythology as a witch, she is also divine, which I kind of love.
Yeah, she's just a goddess who also likes to dabble in her own kind of, craft.
Yeah, exactly. And
it's nice to have hobbies.
It's nice to have hobbies. And of course, like the Greek demigods, some of them are more powerful than others. Like being a demigod, not always a massive deal. I mean, technically she's half nymph, half god, I suppose. But yeah, even though she's not a mortal, she's a divine creature. She's not on par with somebody like Hera.
Yeah.
So yeah, she's a lesser goddess, but a goddess nonetheless. So interesting that she, it's this implication that she has her own power, her own divine power, that she amplifies or accesses that power by baking or cooking or planting or herbalism. So there's lots of these kind of like craft-based elements. So she appears in actually two major Greek mythology epics. One of which is that I always get this wrong. Argonautica. That sounds better, doesn't it? Basically, Jason and the Argonauts. So, Jason and the Argonauts is the story of Jason, massive dickhead, who is basically like, I want to be the king of this place. I think it's Thessaly. I can't remember. He's the least interesting person in the whole thing. It's just sad because I fucking loved Jason and the Argonauts as a kid. That film was great, even with the was that prosthetics, the janky skeletons? No, that's Jason and the Argonauts. But you probably know Jason and the Argonauts as the story of the Argo, the ship, and the stealing of the Golden Fleece. So Circe's brother was king of the kingdom. I cannot remember which. I think it's Corinth or Corinth. I can't remember. It begins with a C, I'm pretty sure. My sister somewhere is screaming that I can't remember my Greek mythology properly. But basically the story is Jason has to steal the Golden Fleece. And he, has a ship and some people, and he goes and he has all these schemes that actually he's not really the mastermind behind them or the power behind them, but we'll come to that in a moment. And he steals the Golden Fleece from Circe's brother. We get this story via eventually Medea, who is the daughter of Circe's brother. She's the princess. So this is the aunt and niece I mentioned. But basically we get this story about Circe and two figures called Scylla and Glaucus. So the story goes that one of the lesser sea gods, Glaucus, was in love with the beautiful maiden Scylla. He comes to Circe and he asks her to help him with a charm to make her fall in love with him, but she actually falls in love.
A love potion.
Potion.
Those are the worst ones to do.
I know, but Circe actually falls in love with Glaucus herself, and of course, it's Greek mythology. All goes horribly wrong. She turns Scylla into a hydra. That hydra then appears in multiple Greek myths because there's basically a pass. You can't get through it because Scylla's there, raging in hydra form.
I feel like the moral of the story of everything that's like, hello, I would like a love potion, please. It's just like, absolutely do not do this. Like, no. This is only going to end up in like, I don't know, like horrible things. Yes. Bad.
So Circe is kind of like a vengeful figure, but still... she's not an evil figure, and partially because this is Greek mythology and nobody's really good or evil in Greek mythology. Everybody's bastard.
In Greek mythology, everyone's just having a good time. Yeah. Like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm going to party. I'm going to turn that person into a horse or a hydra. Like, I'm orgy. What orgy? Yeah. Like, want some wine? That, yeah.
So, they're kind of told the story of Circe because they go to visit her after their debacle with the Golden Fleece because they're seeking cleansing. So even though the story that they hear of Circe is this vengeful, divine witch, Medea, her niece, is like, we should go to Aiaia because my aunt Circe will be able to cleanse us because they've murdered Medea's brother in the process of getting the Golden Fleece. So at this point, we still have this kind of moral ambiguity when it comes to witchcraft, that power is power and there's no good or evil. It's only the wishes and the wills of the people that call upon it. So she's not presented necessarily as an evil figure, even when we get to the Odyssey. So in the Odyssey, Odysseus and his crew land on Aiaia. They're starving, they're, dehydrated. And they find this beautiful, peaceful island with all these docile animals. They basically invade it. Circe invites them to her table, and she turns all of them but Odysseus, because he's got this herb that protects him. But she turns them all into pigs. And she's like, these are disgusting, rowdy men, and I'm going to fucking eat them. Like, how dare they come upon my island, the island of Aiaia.
Yeah. Like, causing havoc, mischief, making a mess. But exactly. They didn't put all their, like, who's going to do all the washing up?
I bet.
Who's going to, like, tidy all the rubbish?
Bet. Now, Odysseus, famous for his charm, does essentially fall in love with Circe, has 1, maybe 2 children with her, stays there for a while. Bear in mind, he's, desperately trying to get back to his house. Fucking Odysseus, man. But anyway.
Yeah, that's his story and he's sticking to
it. He persuades Circe to turn his men back into humans, and eventually they sail off.
So again, like, I'm sorry to keep going off on this Odysseus thing, but it's like he had a relationship with this woman that resulted in potentially multiple children, and the only reason that he's doing that is because he wants to get his men back. Yeah. Like, if I was his partner, I would just be like, oh, man.
Penelope should have just killed all the suitors and taken Ithaca for herself, is what I'm saying. But anyway, back to witchcraft.
Yeah, sorry. You mentioned Odysseus and I'm going to go on. Yeah.
Circe is very much this kind of like, almost like we get these, we get this as well in a lot of stories about Fae. We get this a lot in Irish mythology and other Gaelic mythologies, that she is a figure who is powerful and can be benevolent, but can also be malevolent. She is vengeful, but she's also understanding. She is motherly, but also can be dreadful. And this is something that we then get with Medea. So there were plays about Circe. None of them have survived. She only appears in these other epics. But Circe has been a figure that there's been a lot of modern fascination with. Circe appeared in multiple pre-Raphaelite paintings. The Romantics were very obsessed with the idea of Circe. And even some of the kind of early feminist movements picked up Circe as this figure who was powerful, but also complex, but very much her power and her womanhood were connected. So what about her niece Medea? So Medea is perhaps best known in sort of like culture and literature as a terrible, evil, horrible person who murders her own children to get back at her husband, which is one version of the story as told by Euripides. So Medea is the princess of this kingdom. Jason and his crew turn up, and her dad's a bit of a tyrant. This is Circe's brother, so also a demigod. He's got this golden fleece that gives him, 6 superpowers, I guess. And she basically uses her magic, uses her witchcraft to make sure that everything Jason does is successful. Medea is the power behind it all, essentially. She goes off, they accidentally kill her brother or intentionally kill her brother, depending on the version that you read. She goes off on the Argo with them, because what else can she do? And the two end up falling in love. In some versions, I think it's Hera who decides. The gods are very, there's a lot of bitchiness and a lot of gossip and a lot of this person getting back at this person. But Jason and Medea fall in love. They get married. He becomes king. He finally gets everything that he's wanted, all because of Medea's power.
It's reminding me of, that where it's like, behind every successful man is a successful or, appreciated woman who actually does all the hard work.
Medea is the baddest bitch in this story. So obviously she's in the Argonautica, but then there's the Euripides play that is named after her, which is a tragedy, and it's her as this scorned wife who, is cast aside by her arrogant, cheating husband. And to get revenge on him, she murders their children. Some versions of it have that she kills her children either by accident or is tricked into killing them by burying them alive in the Temple of Hera to try and make them immortal. But in popular literature, and certainly when we get to like the classic revival, so neoclassicism in the 17th and 18th century, she is a figure of women. Not necessarily, I think now we've proclaimed her as like a figure of like women's rage, but the dangers of a woman scorned, and it's a very
and it's very in that kind of vein of women as child killer.
Yes.
And similar to other kind of legends like Lilith and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. And that, because she's so powerful, that makes her dangerous and subversive and destructive. But what's interesting is that so when all of this kicks off, regardless of what version you read, usually what happens is Helios, her grandfather, so the sun god, sends his golden chariot for Medea to escape. So even though she's, Jason's like, she's the worst person in the world, the gods are still like, yeah, Medea, come to safety on this golden chariot. Because she was right. I mean, not the child killing bit. I mean, I don't agree with that, but Jason deserved it. He's a terrible person. So yeah, basically she's super, super powerful. Medea, I think is like the first witch archetype that we get. Circe is this kind of like set apart figure. She's still very closely aligned to the divine. There were some shrines to Circe, although not many. Obviously, Hecate is a goddess. Medea has divine blood, but she's immortal. She's a human, but she has this power, and like, it's kind of plot armor in a way. But Medea is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And what's really interesting is that some scholars have kind of said, well, maybe Euripides and other writers are so harsh on Medea because she is the antithesis of the Athenian ideal. So I mentioned earlier that this is a very strict gender ideal, and she perverts that gender role. She thinks like a man, she acts like a man. So she is kind of rejecting that gender binary, rejecting those gender roles, and her power gives her the ability to be subversive. And what's obviously fascinating is that is still true by modern standards. Medea is another character, and I think there are novels coming out, as we've had a lot lately of Greek mythology revival through a feminist lens, and obviously there is a bit of a it's very white feminism in some ways, but yeah, Medea, one of the first major witch archetypes in the literary canon, is this incredibly powerful woman who is outside and other with the capital O. So I think hopefully what I've shown is that even from this earliest kind of origins of the witch in the European literary canon, or at least the Western European literary canon, is that there is this idea of craft, there's this idea of tradition and lineage. Circe and Medea are aunt and niece. I think that's a really important connection. And it's kind of, in some of the modern reinterpretations, it's implied that Circe taught Medea, or that she passed things on to her, or that they shared kind of knowledge, or that it's inherited in some way. And that these are very complex characters who do bad and good things. You don't have a white witch and a dark witch here. You just have a witch. And a witch is a woman who has power, both innate and through her ability to perform. Again, what's really important, I think, not to be forgotten, is that a lot of this comes from knowledge. These women know herbs, and they know rituals, and they know techniques, and they know potion. There's an incredible amount of knowledge that goes into this. And I think that adds to, as we get into the Common Era and we start to get, more of these kind of like patriarchal gender roles, that knowledge is dangerous when it comes to women. And I think that when we jump to the early modern Christian British witchcraft next time, we are going to see a lot of that.
Yeah. So I guess stay tuned for that. And I mean, I for one, fascinating discussion. Thank you, Lauren. And I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have.
And if there is, this was 3 pages of notes, and I've already realized that was too many. It was too much for one episode. But what I hope is that, I know this is, for some people, this will be nothing new. This will be everything that you've heard before. But when we talked about doing a witch series, we kind of both said, like, actually, it's really important to go to the pre-Christian and to be thinking about, like, why does it say thou shalt not suffer a witch to live in the Bible, apart from the possible mistranslations? Like, if that's in the Bible, that means the concept of a witch existed before Christianity. And if it existed before Christianity, why were these early Christian writers so against it? And why do they then start to link it to concepts of evil or the devil or the demonic? Because, what power did it have? What significance did it have? So we thought, actually, it's really important to kind of jump back, because when we're thinking about the Gothic as a tradition of subversion, a tradition of rebellion and otherness, like, okay, well, why has, it's not just these kind of big ticket things from the 17th and 16th century. There's other aspects to it too. So hopefully we've set a good bit of foundation here. Anything you want to add to any of this? I've talked so much at you this episode.
I have just found it really fascinating. And I guess all I will say is just stay tuned for more witchy conversation next time.
Yeah. And if you do want to hear us talk shit about Odysseus, put that in a request, because we'll gladly do it.
As always, feel free to let us know if there's any topics you want us to talk about, or if there's any guests you want on. But as we said, this is part of a mini-series, so for the next couple of episodes, we will be focused on witchy stuff. So I hope you like witches. And then I guess all that is left for us to say is stay safe and stay spooky.
Stay safe and stay spooky, everybody. Happy spooky season. Bye.